Welcome back to War, Trade, and Empire, Europe in the 18th century. We next get to a development that might seem strange to people in today's world, if you haven't heard of anything like this before. But there were a number of big-time trading corporations and companies, something like today's modern corporations, but we're used to those, so that wouldn't be entirely weird. But these were usually monopoly, government-granted monopolies. So the King of England or the leaders of Holland, in the Dutch East India Company's case, were given monopoly rights to trade in a certain area. And the most famous are the British East India Company, which you see here, and the Dutch East India Company, which you see here. But there were other companies that these trading colonial powers had other parts of the world. The Levant Company, there was a South Sea Company. So different countries, different kingdoms granted monopolies to corporations to trade in certain parts of the world. But what makes it odd to our ears today is that these companies often had tremendous amounts of power, which doesn't seem odd either, so bear with me, but to the extent that they actually governed colonies sometimes and went to war to defend and promote their colonies at times with their own kind of private mercenary armies raised with their own capital and trained by their own guys. With that being said, it was always true that if it's, say, the British East India Company, the company, though it's basically colonizing India, as you see on the right, and running the colony, taking care of political, military, economic operations in running that colony and that part of the world on a daily basis. But it did have to answer in the end to the home government. But they were given this company and others like it around the world a lot of leeway much of the time, and this took place for a number of centuries. The British East India Company said at one point, kind of a motto, slogan, "Our business is trade, not war," which ended up not being entirely true. There was a French East India Company as well. Again, the Dutch one, or VOC, mentioned there. Robert Marx, quoted already a couple of times, says the agents for this extension of European interstate conflict around the world were not at first governments of European states, but private trading companies, the first being the Dutch East India Company, VOC. All were private companies chartered by their governments and given monopoly rights to trade, all in keeping with mercantilist ideas. They were formed with a permanent capital stock that could be traded. The forerunners of the modern corporation and their success at organizing trade and raising profits meant that the corporation would play an increasingly important role in European industrialization. And here, an important role in European trade and empire. At a broader level of development, we see here the Atlantic system, or better known usually as the triangular trade. And this, by the 18th century, mid-18th century at the latest, had become the center of the world economy. About 2.5 centuries before, circa 1500, the center of the world economy, you couldn't even see on this, you can't even see on this map right here, because it was in the Indian Ocean, centering around India, but including East African merchants, Arab Muslim merchants, Indonesian merchants, Chinese merchants, and so on and so forth. But through all kinds of underlying processes, not by anybody's design, impersonal processes, over a 200+ year period, the center of the world economy ends up being here, partially through European colonization of the Americas and the great amount of wealth and power that generated for them. So, and the Atlantic system is partly an explanation of this and partly a symptom or result of it. To keep it simple, manufactured goods taken from Europe were taken to the west coast of Africa, in exchange for gold, spices, gold, and slaves, which you see on the graphic and the map, and slaves in that horrific Middle Passage we talked about a little bit earlier, taken to South America, the Caribbean, or the East Coast, was now the United States, and traded or sold and brought back the other way: cotton, fur, lumber, tobacco, sugar, molasses, fruit, and on and on and on. So this triangular trade, slaves, sugar, and guns, was a giant engine of economic growth and the center of the world economy, putting the Europeans, of course, right in the middle of the action from this point forward. Now we get to the war part of this, which we haven't talked about other than to kind of set things up as far as how militaries worked, navies functioned within this global trading and colonial system. We're going to talk about two wars, one in Eastern Europe called the Great Northern War. Yeah, okay, Northern and Eastern Europe, and one that's sometimes referred to as the Second 100 Years' War. Oops, because I'm not down there yet. Which actually isn't one war, but it's sometimes kind of rounded down into one war, as we'll see. But that took place in Western and Central Europe, sometimes even beyond that. Some of them became global. But the Great Northern War was a crucial moment in European history, partly because, as you see here, a number of the countries we talked about, kingdoms we talked about, early in the class that were kind of might have beens, had beens, could have beens, as far as the major powers of Europe are concerned, were involved in this, Great Northern War. Denmark, Poland, Sweden. We talked about all three of those. And you also see Russia on the screen here. Russia is the one that does, of course, emerge as a great power. But it's really only after this war, not before, that Russia truly emerges sort of as a top-notch, top-level power in Europe. As mentioned in that earlier lecture, Charles XII, King of Sweden, a military genius, displayed his incredible military prowess and ability in the early phases of the war, and it looked like Sweden was sort of off to the races, and had they won the war, it's possible, not for sure, but that they may have ended up being a long-term major power. Around 1700, we see a coalition of Denmark, Poland, and Russia, all three allying to attack Sweden. But not only did Charles and his military forces fend off the invaders, he quickly knocked Denmark out of the war. So I'm not going to go into the X's and O's of this, but it looked like Sweden again was on the rise. But Charles turned then to the eastern Baltic Sea. Baltic is the sea kind of between Germany, the Scandinavian countries, Estonia, Latvia, cold weather sea. But he crushed Russian forces at Narva in 1700. So the trajectory looks up and up and up for Sweden. However, this was not to be in the end, but before things started to take a turn for the worst, Charles and Sweden defeated Poland and forced its king to step down from power. So it wasn't until the fateful 1707 invasion of Russia by Charles XII that things started to go awry. As I'm sure you already know, and we'll get to more of these later on, it's not a good idea to invade Russia. And so Charles XII, one of a number to learn this lesson the hard way. He intended to actually dethrone the Russian Tsar, the indefatigable Peter the Great. But at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, which is in the Ukraine today, southern Russia, then the rise of Russia as a great European power was sort of there on display for everyone to see. And if people hadn't been paying attention to Russia before, at least outside of their neck of the woods, they certainly were after this. So Peter the Great in Russia decisively defeated Charles II, and Sweden at Poltava. Tim Blanning, a current historian, in a really good book on this time period in European history, said Poltava was a truly world historical event. And the amazing reason for that is, again, it did put Russia indelibly on the map of European powers. The great philosopher Leibniz said it's being said that the Tsar will be formidable to the rest of Europe. And not only was he right, but that was putting it mildly. Which brings us to Peter the Great. You might have already guessed that the kings of this era tended to name themselves or give themselves a moniker or nickname. So he was great to himself, although great sometimes means powerful, of course, as well. So he didn't mean Peter like, hey, look how great I am, but Peter, look how powerful I am, which, of course, was true, but none too modest. So Peter the Great is this astonishing figure in Western or European history, one of the most fun to talk about. He was about 6'7", and if you look at his dates of birth and death there, people were small in those days. I mean, a lot smaller than today. So 6'7" then is about 7 feet tall. So can you imagine that Russia was an authoritarian, absolute monarchy, which we haven't talked about yet, but it was in most ways more so than anything we've seen in Western or Central Europe. So the Tsar was already an intimidating presence, whoever the Tsar was. But here and now you've got a 7-foot Tsar running around. So he must have scared the daylights out of everyone. To make it worse, or more difficult to deal with him, he was just full of energy. This guy was just a doer, incredibly active, incredibly filled with ideas, not just that he sort of ruminated about in his head, but things that he actually wanted to get done, that he did get done or tried to get done. A very hands-on type of ruler. There's a couple of funny stories about him. One is that not only was he 6'7", again, equivalent to like 7 feet tall today, but he was so full of energy and so, impatient to get things done that he walked at a really fast clip. So as you can see sort of in the upper right, although I don't know if this is what the picture was intending to do, but for his servants and hangers-on and attendees to keep up with him, when he was walking at sort of a normal pace for him, they're having to run to keep up with him. Because their strides aren't as long anyway, but he's moving really fast, so they have to run as he walks just to stay even. Peter the Great was a typical Tsar of that era. Russia could be a brutal place, and he could be a brutal Tsar. He was also known to carry a stick around with him, and if one of his advisors said something or did something he didn't like, he just beat him with a stick, not to death, but just to keep him in line. So this guy was a piece of work. He came to believe that Russia needed to emulate the European countries in the West, the ones we've been talking about until now, and forced the country to move in that direction, in many ways against its will. So maybe the classic symbol of this and example of it is that he moved the capital from Moscow hundreds of miles to the west to St. Petersburg, humbly named after himself, which was a city that he had built. It wasn't even built yet, and he decided, we need a capital further to the west, I'm going to build one. And so, as Tim Blanning already quoted, says the move of the capital from Moscow to the newly created St. Petersburg did much more than wrench the Russian elites 370 miles to the west, for it was accompanied by an equally top-down transformation of their culture. So Peter the Great believed not only that Russia needed to emulate Western European technology, Western European ways of doing warfare, ways of doing government, taking advantage of the scientific learning coming from England and France, but he believed that the culture had to be entirely changed as well. Another good example of this, and a kind of a funny story as well, is that the boyars, Russian nobility in general, traditionally wore kind of these long, kind of thin beards, sometimes not so thin even. And since the Western European nobility didn't do that, Peter established an edict or order that you gotta shave off your beards. Those are backwards. They're not in keeping with the modern world. He thought Western Europe was more modern, more advanced, and superior, and he thought we need to emulate them and catch up. But some, as you might expect, of the nobility were recalcitrant and didn't want to do any of this stuff, let alone cut off their beards, and some of them didn't. And I don't know in how many cases this happened, but in at least a few, he actually invited or forced members of the nobility, one at a time, to visit him at his palace, and actually got the pruning shears, the scissors out himself, and grabbed the guys by the beard and cut it off himself. Right? Didn't just have people do it, but he did it himself. This 6'7" intimidator, grabbing Russian nobles by the scruff of their beard and hacking off their the hair on their chin. So you can sort of picture all these things, I think, and see a guy with tremendous will, tremendous energy, and sort of tremendous gifts for getting things done. He was also very hands-on as well. He didn't just initiate a shipbuilding program, again copying the latest technology from Europe, but he also sort of learned to build himself and would go out there with his builders and teach them and learn himself with a hammer in hand, and actually did work. He took a trip himself to Western Europe disguised as a peasant, which is also humorous because here's a guy that's 6'7", sort of a well-known and major power figure in Europe at the time. He dresses as a peasant, but it doesn't exactly make him incognito. People just go, oh, there's the Russian Tsar in peasant's clothes. But he did through that trip to Western Europe show how hands-on leader he was and how serious he was at turning Russia into not just a great power militarily, but a great power period, modeling itself on Western European ways, technology, and so forth. However, after Peter the Great is gone and dies, the next czars weren't as interested in westernizing as much as he was. They couldn't totally go back in the direction, so part of it was permanent, and there were later czars that moved further steps, however reluctantly, in that direction. He didn't do so reluctantly. He did so with verve. He believed it was absolutely necessary and was completely gung-ho about the project. But the Russians, before and after, were ambivalent about all of this. Peter was not, but the people as a whole were. The Russians sort of always have thought of themselves as partly European and partly not. They want to emulate the Europe, they want to be part of Europe, and they don't. And think of themselves as Europeans and non-Europeans. So there's certainly an ambivalence there that did makes it a little bit premature after Peter the Great to think, wait a minute, the Russians are sort of moving straight to a Western European style government system, etc. The Second 100 Years' War, again, there's several wars you see here. The historians just get kind of clever here in a series of wars between 1687 and 1815, including the 9 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession. I bet you didn't know there had been one, but there was. The 7 Years' War, which you probably heard of, the American Revolution, which you may have heard of, and the Wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The main overarching thing that all these had in common was they were all primarily wars between Great Britain and France. Yes, even the American Revolution, at least from the European perspective, that is. In the 9 Years' War, which we've already talked about just a little bit, because this came just as William of Orange, who became William III, came to power in England after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And remember I said in class that he had taken them immediately into war against Louis XIV, along with his Dutch troops, which he did. And this war lasted for, again, 9 years. Sometimes it's called King William's War, sometimes called the 9 Years' War. The Treaty of Ryswick in the latter year there showed not a decisive victory for any of the combatants, but it did serve to box in and contain French power on land, which had really been the goal all along. So you could say that William of Orange, William III, actually won this round with Louis XIV. Louis XIV was a perennial threat to tip the balance of power, and sure enough, here's somewhat of a balancing act, pardon the pun, but William's Dutch forces and now William's English forces side by side, and with some other combatants as well, putting or keeping Louis XIV in the box. The War of the Spanish Succession, as Louis XIV said in cocky fashion, there are no more Pyrenees. Pyrenees being the mountain range between France and Spain, was his way of saying, I've just erased the boundaries and border between the two. I've brought the two together. Excuse me, I needed a sip of water there. So Europe had been preoccupied around the turn of the 18th century with who would succeed, as Sir Wallach said, the slow-witted and childless Charles II of Spain. The main reason that he was slow-witted and childless, however politically incorrect that phrasing would be today, this book was written about 15-20 years ago, is that as a Habsburg, he had been the unfortunate victim of years and years of incest. The Habsburgs had wanted to keep their money and their land in the family, and that was one of their strategies for doing so, marrying within the family over and over again. And Charles II, Carlos II, was one of the victims of this. He was virtually incapacitated for much of his time on the throne. And Louis XIV was up to the north, kind of plotting and waiting, seeing an opportunity to swoop in and take control of Spain, either directly or more indirectly through the weakness of Spain under these kind of conditions. So there'd been negotiation for a long time about France possibly taking control of some land in Spain. But when Charles died right at the turn of the century, his will made it abundantly clear that the whole kingdom was to pass to Philip or Charles of Austria if the former refused it. And Philip of Anjou, you see above, who was Louis XIV's grandson, made this situation potentially explosive. Louis XIV could have easily, and everyone was sort of hanging on his decision, told his grandson to stand down and to decline the throne of Spain, and he probably should have, because he knew it was going to be seen as France trying to tip the balance of power in its favor to become a hegemonic power, and was likely to set off a war. And when Louis XIV, now much later in his life and career, older monarch, decided to actually go through with the more aggressive way of doing this, which is actually supporting his grandson in his bid for the throne. This made war likely, maybe even inevitable. And in fact, this is what happens. Louis moves his troops into the Spanish Netherlands in 1701, knowing that by that time a coalition had formed, balancing against him a new grand alliance against Louis XIV's France, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, England, and United Provinces of the Dutch, Holland. The main battlefront was in the Holy Roman Empire, major battles at Blenheim 1704, Ramillies 2 years later, and Oudenarde 2 years after that were mostly victories for the Allies against Louis XIV, especially Blenheim in 1704. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, once again boxed in France, contained it, and did prevent Louis's grandson from taking the throne of Spain. So the balance of power at work and working once again. The Battle of Blenheim, just mentioned, became a symbol of Britain's emergence as a power to be reckoned with. It was the first land victory in continental Europe that the English or British had won since the Middle Ages. Remember, Britain was mostly a naval power. They had a superb land army, but it was always relatively small. But at Blenheim, which is in Bavaria, the Duke of a guy named John Churchill, later becoming known as the Duke of Marlborough after he was given a dukedom, given a noble title for this very victory by the king. But he moved his troops all the way across Europe in very quick fashion. I forget how many days it took from basically Holland to the Danube in Bavaria, which is where the Battle of Blenheim took place, and won a great victory with Allied forces fighting alongside two Austrian troops under a guy named Prince Eugene, another one of the sort of great military commanders of the era. But John Churchill became a hero. Duke of Marlborough, eventually a palace known as Blenheim Palace, and the Marlborough Dukes, forever famous. In fact, a much more recent British political figure, Winston Churchill, is a descendant of John Churchill, although Winston Churchill was not the Duke of Marlborough because he wasn't a first son, he was a second or third son, I forget. But this is a very storied family, starting with this guy, John Churchill. But just like we saw in the Northern War in the East, that the Battle of Poltava was kind of a coming out party for the Russians. Blenheim was kind of something similar for the English around the same time. This happened actually 5 years before, but close enough. The Treaty of Utrecht, again at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, did overall cause sort of bitterness in Louis XIV. He had been, of course, an aggressive king for a long time, and he hadn't been able to push his boundaries, his borders out too much. So this is fairly common for him by this point, but he was bitter about the whole thing. In the War of the Austrian Succession, coming in 1739, lasting for close to 10 years, we see France and Austria as continental rivals once again. And this war was partially caused because, once again, a succession crisis, somewhat different than the previous one in Spain. But this was partly because the Holy Roman Emperor, or the Habsburg rulers, next in line for the throne was his daughter Maria Theresa, very famous figure in European history. And Charles VI, the father, had tried to set things up for diplomatically and legally, so that there wouldn't be a major sort of ruffles, a major war or civil conflict by pushing through something called the pragmatic sanction. But it didn't exactly work out that way. So among others, taking advantage of what was considered to be Austrian weakness, this was perceived to be that, with the future of Habsburg leadership under some question. Remember, because of the misogyny of the times, anytime a woman took the throne, just like when a little kid takes the throne, it was seen as almost an open invitation for some usurper or somebody that thought they were legitimate to step in and take power. But there were wolves outside of the Habsburg domains as well. One of them, the brilliant, devious, young, and brash Frederick the Great of Prussia, who used the opportunity of Austria kind of being sidetracked, being diverted with this domestic crisis, to invade the Holy Roman Empire, its territory in a place called Silesia, a province of the Holy Roman Empire. So this is a lightning conquest, 1740, and Frederick had just taken the throne from his deceased father. His father, Frederick William II, or Frederick William the First, this was the first, he had built Prussia's army to what eventually became a famous military. It was often said that, has been by historians after the fact, but that Prussia was an army with a state. It was an army with a state attached to it, not the other way around. But it was Frederick William I that had built that army primarily. But he had never used it. He had never used the army. And it's somewhat strange that he didn't, because he was a brutal, very aggressive king, extremely difficult to deal with, and was abusive to his son in many and extreme ways. And Frederick, the kid, the son, was gifted, was a military genius, one of the greats in European history, but he was also a gifted scholar. He was a gifted musician, flute player, and so was sort of extremely cultured, extremely well educated, as well as being a powerful and extremely aggressive king militarily and politically. The other countries sort of piled on Austria's perceived weakness as well, most importantly France. Great Britain was alarmed at what the French were doing, and so they get involved as well. And so among the five major powers, with Russia not being involved in this, at least actively, you see Great Britain and Austria square off against France and Prussia. Prussia, under Frederick the Great, winning yet another major victory at a place called Hohenfriedberg, 5 years after the invasion of Silesia. In the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, 3 years after that, there was a lot of loss for little gain, as you see in a lot of these wars here, except for Frederick the Great and Prussia. So if I'm repeating myself and kind of stacking these up now, if Blenheim put England on the map as a great power, and Poltava had put Russia on the map, it's the War of the Austrian Succession that puts Prussia firmly on the map, or on the road, if not already there, to being one of the great powers of Europe.